Hi there. Originally I wanted to make this video to be about the entirety of the Italian coastal fleet, but spading all of them is taking quite a while, so I just decided to split it like this. I also plan to do this for the other nations, which should get their videos soon, but this will take a while. But now, on to the main subject of this video, the Italian coastal vessels of rank 1 to 3. We'll start at the very beginning with the reserve MAS 561. Not the original reserve for the Italian fleet, but most certainly a good one, so let's take a closer look. Her main armament consists of one 20mm and two 12.7s. Yes, all of your guns belong to the primary weapon group. For a reserve, this is a heavy armament. Granted, the 20mm gun doesn't have the best gun arc or the largest belt, but it supplements the 12.7s extremely well. The reload for the 20mm varies between 2.34 and 1.8 seconds. Though not long at all, though when it comes to coastal vessels a second or two can count. Though the 12.7s can usually continue their fire while the 20 is reloading. When the 12.7s do have to reload though, it can vary between 5.2 to 4 seconds. Quite a bit longer, but still not too long. But again, in these matches seconds count. But I find this a good price to pay for the heaviest gun armament of any reserve coastal vessel. Then we have her explosive armament. These are either 2 depth charges, 2 torpedoes, or a combination of both, or nothing at all. I recommend taking the combination of both of them. At the BR of 1.0 there are plenty of people who don't yet fully understand what threats there are about them, and with a payload of 50 kilograms the depth charges can kill when timed well. The torpedoes are alright with a payload of 200 kilograms of TNT, and depending on whether you have the torpedo mode modification, a range of 3 kilometers with a speed of 81 kilometers an hour, or a range of 8 kilometers with a speed of 56 kilometers an hour. I recommend not equipping the torpedo mode modification. At 1.0 a range of 3 kilometers is more than enough. The mobility of MAS 561 is quite good too, with a spaded top speed of 80 kilometers an hour, and yes, that's for realistic battles. Her responsiveness to all commands is incredibly good too. I don't think you'll have any problems with the mobility of MAS 561. Survivability is nothing too special for a vessel of this BR. You'll get gunned down rather quickly, especially since you have to show quite some broadside to get all guns firing. But with 3 spawns available you shouldn't be too worried. When it comes to the playstyle of MAS 561, I suggest playing aggressively. Again, you have 3 spawns, so losing your vessel once isn't that much of a problem. Her armament easily puts her at the top among the reserves, and even outguns a few higher BR vessels. If you really go aggressive, then you'll maybe be able to get some kills with the depth charges too. Pros: excellent armament, good mobility. Cons: poor survivability. Verdict: spade it. Not only should you spade it because it's a reserve and there's not much choice, but I believe that the MAS 561 is genuinely a very enjoyable vessel. I hope most of you will see this too when playing it. Then up next we have what used to be the Italian reserve coastal vessel, MAS 555. Was it really so bad that it needed replacing? Well, when it comes to her armament we see the single 20mm gun at the rear as her only armament. This 20mm does have quite a large dead zone towards the front of the vessel. It is still quite powerful, but with the small belt and the reload varying between 2.34 and 1.8 seconds, you'll often find yourself without a gun. This is the main reason it got replaced. The gun isn't the easiest to manage, especially if this is your first taste of naval. But if you have gotten the basics down, then you'll certainly be capable of using the gun well. As for explosive armament, we see the same 2 torpedoes with a payload of 200 kilograms of TNT. And depending on the torpedo mode modification, a range of 3 kilometers with a speed of 81 kilometers an hour, or a range of 8 kilometers with a speed of 56 kilometers an hour. Again, I recommend not equipping the torpedo mode modification. Other than these, there are a whopping 6 depth charges, again identical in stats to the MAS 561, with a 50 kilogram payload. The larger number does make them a bit more useful, and with the chaos of these lower BRs, I'd suggest taking them with you too, as getting a kill with them is always fun. Mobility of the MAS 555 is also identical to the MAS 561, with a top speed of 80 km an hour. And again, a good rudder response, turn time, good acceleration and deceleration. Overall, very solid mobility. Survivability again is pretty much identical too, but the greatest difference is that you don't have 3 spawns like you do with the MAS 561. So you'll want to be a bit more cautious if you actually want to spade this as fast as possible. As for playstyle, as I already hinted at it, you should be a bit more cautious with the MAS 555 than you would with the MAS 561. You have fewer guns and fewer spawns, so be really careful. Pros: good mobility. Cons: poor survivability, difficult armament. Verdict: consider it. MAS 555 is a bit more difficult to use than her replacement, so might not be as enjoyable, though it should still be a relatively easy vehicle to spade. Up next we go up to 1.3 with the VAS 201. Is it an upgrade from the reserve? Let's find out. Armed with 2 of the same 20mm guns as the previous 2 vessels, it is quite a decent armament. But again, the small belt size and the relatively long reload can bite it in the back, so make your shots count. As for the explosive armament, we again see the same torpedoes with the same stats as the last 2 vehicles, and 16 depth charges. In this case, however, I cannot recommend using them, as the VAS 201 is rather slow. Speaking of which, the mobility of VAS 201 is quite a change from the previous 2 vessels, with a top speed varying between 33 and 38 km an hour. A fair bit slower, but luckily the other characteristics are still decent, with a good rudder response, turn rate and engine response. Survivability is again nothing too noteworthy, as most coastal vessels are incredibly similar in this field. They don't like taking fire, so be sure to weigh in the risks when heading for open waters. As for playstyle, I suggest being a bit more passive. The low speed of VAS 201 means you can't easily get out or even into trouble. Her firepower is alright, yes, but these guns have their weaknesses. And when facing a competent opponent, VAS 201 will not last long. So I recommend hiding behind a lot of cover and protecting capture points. Pros: alright armament. Cons: poor mobility. Verdict: skip it. It is quite a shift from the very speedy MAS 561 and 555. So much so that the slow speed of VAS 201 really is a deal breaker. She isn't too difficult to spade because she's still very cheap, but her mobility will lead to much frustration. Next we break into rank 2 while still staying at 1.3, with the MS-15, a similar vessel to VAS 201 by appearance, but quite different. So let's take a closer look. MS-15 is again armed with the same 2 20mm as the previous vessel, and with similar gun arcs. By now you should know what these guns are like. Somewhat low rate of fire, small belts and a reload varying between 2.34 and 1.8 seconds. Not bad weapons, but not that particularly good either, as it will usually take more than 1 belt of the 2 guns to destroy a target. When it comes to the explosive armament, MS-15 carries 2 torpedoes with a payload of 270 kg of TNT equivalent. And depending on whether you equip the torpedo mode modification or not, a base range of 4 km with a speed of 91 km an hour, or a range of 8 km with a speed of 70 km an hour. For once, both options are pretty alright, though I personally still prefer speed over range, and the range of 4 km is still more than long enough at 1.3. There are also 12 depth charges which still could be useful, but take them at your own risk. Mobility is a bit better again, with a top speed varying between 52 and 61 km an hour, with an alright rudder and engine response, though perhaps a bit on the lower end with a somewhat slow turn rate. Still an alright mobility, though be sure not to be reckless. As for survivability, again standard for a coastal vessel, though being not the fastest and having to show quite a bit of broadside, MS-15 can be a bit vulnerable. For playstyle it is a bit tricky, the speed still allows for some options, but isn't good enough to get you out of trouble. So be cautious in MS-15, not passive, but cautious. Pros: alright armament, okay mobility. Cons: poor survivability. Verdict: consider it. MS-15 isn't really anything special, not good nor particularly bad. Just a perfectly standard vessel for its BR with perhaps potent torpedoes. MS-53 is up next in rank 2 and steps up in BR to 1.7. And if you didn't know better, you'd think it's not a big deal, but just wait and see. MS-53 is again armed with the same 2 20mm guns that you're used to by now. Other than the usual negatives, there's a major weakness in this armament. The rear 20mm gun has a very bad firing arc, making it only capable of firing behind the vessel. This means that there is only a very thin sliver where the guns actually overlap their firing arcs, so most of your fighting will be done with a single 20mm gun. This is quite bad, as at 1.7 you will see things that will easily outgun you, even if you had both guns. As for the explosive armament, we see 4 torpedoes, though 2 different kinds. In the frontmost tubes we see torpedoes with a payload of 270 kg of TNT equivalent, and depending on whether you have the torpedo mode modification equipped or not, a range of 4 km with a speed of 93 km an hour, or a range of 8 km with a speed of 81 km an hour. So here, both options certainly have merit, but I personally recommend always taking speed over range. Though you should choose whether you equip the modification at your own discretion. A thing to note is that these torpedo tubes have doors that need to open before launching a torpedo, so be sure to stay on target until you see the torpedo yeet itself out of the launcher. The rear 2 torpedoes have a payload of 200 kg of TNT equivalent, and a range of 3 km and a speed of 81 km an hour. These torpedoes are also completely unaffected by the torpedo mode modification, which is rather odd, so keep it in mind. There are also 12 depth charges, but at this BR they're starting to lose any potential use they had. As for mobility, even here MS-53 falls a bit short compared to previous MS-15. MS-53 has a top speed varying between 50 and 58 km an hour. Not that much slower, but still slower. Though in the other characteristics she is pretty similar, still a decent rudder and engine response and a decent turn rate. Survivability is also rather similar, though with the additional torpedoes there is quite a big risk of them detonating under fire. For playstyle I suggest you be very passive, as you functionally only have one gun at a time on MS-53. It might be a somewhat interesting PT boat if you have to up-tier it to a destroyer BR, as the torpedoes are quite decent, though I haven't personally tested them at targets of that size. Pros: good torpedoes, alright mobility. Cons: poor gun layout, mediocre survivability. Verdict: skip it. MS-53 is a very difficult ship to enjoy, mainly because of the rear gun. It is still rather cheap to spade, though it really won't be a fun time. And to accompany MS-53 at 1.7 and rank 2 we see Stefano Turr. A rather odd vehicle, but it's an interesting vehicle to take a look at, so let's do just that. Stefano Turr's main armament consists of 3 13.2mm machine guns at the front and a rather odd staggered formation, and a single 6.5mm machine gun at the rear, though to be fair it can be pretty much ignored as it's next to useless. I find the 13.2mm guns to be quite alright at a PR of 1.7, though their effective range certainly isn't the best. Their damage potential is alright with the 3 of them, but with their odd configuration means you can only get all 3 firing when the target is to the front and to the left of you. This limitation does restrict Stefano Turr quite a bit, but if you can find yourself in decent positions, I find that they work quite well. The reload varies between 2.6 and 2 seconds, so you'll certainly notice when you have to reload, and with a 30 round belt per gun, this will happen rather often. As for explosive armament, you have 4 torpedoes with a payload of 170 kg of TNT equivalent, and as usual, depending on whether you have the torpedo mode modification unlocked and equipped, you have either a range of 4 km and a speed of 76 km an hour, or a range of 8 km with a speed of 56 km an hour. Not the best torpedoes to be honest, and I certainly recommend in this case to not equip the torpedo mode modification, just to keep any potency that these torpedoes have. There are also 2 racks of 6 depth charges for a total of 12. You could bring them, though they're not quite as useful as they would be on a very fast craft, though take them at your own volition. So when it comes to mobility, Stefano Turr isn't the worst at a top speed of 51 to 59 km an hour. A bit sluggish stock, and that's in the other aspects too, but when she gets all her mobility upgrades it is quite nice, not exceptional, but pretty solid in all other aspects. These being a solid rudder and engine response and a solid turn rate. Luckily, Stefano is rather cheap, so getting these modifications shouldn't be too difficult. Survivability is again nothing special as with most vessels, though I will say that Stefano Turr is a rather chunky vessel, so it's pretty easy to get hit and take a lot of damage. So, what playstyle would I recommend for Stefano Turr? Easy, advance to a left hand corner that's pretty close to an objective and with a lot of cover, only exposing your 13.2mm guns and the necessary hull for it. But when things get too hot, be sure to use your mobility to get out of dodge. The hard part when playing Stefano Turr is deciding when to move from your position. Your torpedoes aren't that useful and can be quite risky, though I still suggest taking them, as 4 torpedoes can be quite useful when you throw them down a lane that will see a lot of traffic. If I were to summarize, use Stefano Turr to hold very particular corners, but be careful that you don't get outflanked, as you'll be very vulnerable then. Pros: decent armament, decent mobility. Cons: susceptible to flank attacks, awkward gun placement. Verdict: consider it. I personally enjoyed Stefano Turr when spading it, though I have heard different opinions. It requires a very specific way to play, but if you can get the hang of it, I've found it to be very enjoyable, so please do give it a try. Now we step into rank 3 with GIS 811 at 2.3, the BR of all Italian coastal vessels of rank 3. So what makes GIS 811 tick? Let's find out. GIS 811 is armed with a familiar single 20mm gun at the front and a quadruple 20mm mount at the rear. This quadruple 20mm mount is the German Flakvierling, though quite a potent weapon. This rear quad 20mm is rather restricted though when it comes to the firing arcs, only really being capable of firing when the vessel shows broadside. The other drawback is the relatively long reload of this quad 20mm mount, varying between 7.8 and 6 seconds, which is quite some time to wait for guns that only have a 40 round belt per gun. So be sure that either your target is sunk or you're in cover by the time you have to reload. As for the explosive armament, we see 2 torpedoes of the same ilk as the ones on the rank 1 boats. These have a payload of 200 kilograms and again, depending on if you have the torpedo mode modification unlocked or unequipped, have either a range of 4 km and a speed of 81 km an hour, or a range of 8 km with a speed of 56 km an hour. And as usual, I recommend not equipping the torpedo mode modification, as a range of 4 km is usually more than enough. For mobility, we see a nice breath of fresh air with a top speed varying between 63 and 74 km an hour. The rudder and engine response are excellent and so is the turn rate. Stock it's alright with that top speed of 63 km an hour, but it can feel just a tad too slow sometimes. But when you unlock all the mobility modifications, it feels just right. Survivability is a bit lesser because it's a fairly tall yet small boat, so GIS 811 will take a lot of damage quickly. Though with proper positioning and the use of drive-by tactics, you can certainly improve your chances at survival. For playstyle, I pretty much already gave it away, but use your mobility to flank and spank, quickly ducking between several positions of cover to allow your guns to reload and assess the situation. GIS 811 thrives when it can drive by targets and duck into cover before they can respond. Pros: excellent mobility, potent armament. Cons: lackluster survivability, somewhat poor gun arcs. Verdict: spade it. I really enjoyed spading GIS 811, but you certainly want to prioritize upgrading her mobility to truly get her to full potential. I hope you all can enjoy this vessel as much as I did. And second to last, we have MV611. A rather weird looking vessel and probably the weakest of the rank 3s. Let's see why. MV611 is armed with 6 single-mounted 20mm guns, with only a maximum of 4 guns firing, with a broadside. Again, they're the same 20mm guns you find on a lot of these Italian coastal vessels. A reload varying between 2.34 and 1.8 seconds at 2.3, these guns are starting to really lose their punch as compared to the other things that roam around on the battlefield. The main issue being their range. As a low caliber gun, these 20s really aren't that effective at range. Because there isn't much else in the armament department for MV611, I'll just mention it here, but the ammo choice isn't really that important, with all belts having both high explosive and armor piercing in them, just in different ratios. I personally do prefer the armor piercing heavy belts, as I find it deals with bow tankers better, though it really is up to you to decide which you take, and you really should experiment. And as seeing that's MV611's only armament, I'll go talk about her mobility, which is a return to the familiar with a top speed varying between 52 and 61 km an hour, when stock MV611 mobility is alright, but you'll notice the difference when fully upgraded. Survivability wise, as usual, it's pretty meh. Not tough, but not really exceptionally squishy for a vessel of its type. But as with all vessels of this type, try to minimize the damage you take as much as possible, especially with the amount of guns you have on your deck. Playstyle, a bit tricky for this ship to be honest. The 20mm guns start to fall behind in potential when it comes to this BR bracket. And with no explosive armament whatsoever, MV611 is rather inflexible. To make the most of these guns, I suggest letting the enemies come to you. Take up a position to ambush a relatively busy traffic lane, and be sure to be prepared when an enemy comes. There's not really much else I can say. Pros. Alright mobility, lots of guns. Cons, lackluster armament, no explosive armament. Verdict, skip it. It's not the worst vessel out there, but with the RP costs increasing, I can't honestly say to consider spading it. It really is a rather lackluster vessel with rather limited range, and it is that lack of range that really is the Achilles heel for the MV611. Some of you may enjoy it, but don't be too concerned if you don't. And finally for the rank 3s we have the MS-472. Finally getting rid of that Italian 20mm gun. Let's see if it's a considerable improvement. MS-472 is armed with the legendary 40mm Bofors gun. This gun is probably the best combination of damage potential, penetration and range. Though in my opinion it can be a bit of a jack of all trades, master of none situation. Especially with only one of these guns at the front of the ship. The major strength of this gun though is the fact that it doesn't really have a reload time in between the 4-round clips. So you will never have to worry about downtime for reloads. But with only one gun you can get into trouble when it gets knocked out. All in all, a decent armament, though easy to lose. When it comes to explosive armament we see a familiar torpedo in 2 single launchers. These have a payload of 200 kg of TNT and depending again on whether you've got the torpedo mode modification unlocked and equipped, a speed of 81 km an hour with a range of 3 km, or a speed of 56 km an hour with a range of 8 km. I, as usual, suggest never equipping the torpedo mode modification, as there are only very specific situations where it would be better than the stock performance of these torpedoes. There are also 8 depth charges, but instead of them being on rails at the rear, they're mounted all along the side of MS-472, making the risk of them being detonated quite large, so I suggest you don't bring them. As for mobility, MS-472 falls in line with most of the other Italian boats we've seen, with a top speed varying between 52 and 61 km an hour. This should be pretty familiar by now, and the other mobility factors are pretty alright as expected. Nothing too good, nothing too bad. Survivability is much the same, nothing too special, so I won't pause on it for too long. The only thing really of note is the vulnerable 40mm gun at the front of the ship. As for playstyle, MS-472 can be a bit aggressive. With her frontally mounted 40mm, she could just poke around corners and keep the rest of her hull hidden. And if you were to face larger targets, then the torpedoes should be able to deal with those. MS-472 isn't the fastest, so don't be in a rush. Move from cover to cover, and when you're in a good spot there's little reason to leave it. All in all, MS-472 is a solid vessel, though with its weaknesses. It's a good introduction for what is to come in Italian 3, but those will be a topic for a separate video. Pros: decent firepower, torpedoes. Cons: only one gun, mediocre mobility. Verdict: spade it. MS-472 is somewhat expensive to spade, but I believe she's solid enough that spading her should be pretty consistent, as long as the matchmaking doesn't interfere, as at 2.3 the matchmaking experience can be pretty volatile. This is all for now. There are more coming, with the next video probably centering around the American tree. I've become rather busy outside of YouTube, so it's entirely possible that my uploads will slow down even further. I'm sorry for this, but please bear with it. Though, to finish on a positive note, I have started up a Discord server where you'll be able to contact me more directly, and I hope to turn it into a place where naval players can go share their experience with people that truly know naval. So for now, goodbye, and may your seas be calm.